coming out. This is, no, we have This is for the website. Thanks for coming out. This is an event that the Richmond Alumni chapter has organized, so thanks to everyone who helped do that. We're hoping to do a number of events. We have done some in the past. We're hoping to do even more over the coming months, so keep posted. Go ahead and sign up with them. You can either sign up through our Facebook group or contact Mr. Waller, get your name on the mailing list so we can reach out to you in the future. But tonight, we're very happy to have Mr. John Wilkes here to talk about the Negro Exhibit the Negro Exhibit at the Jamestown Tercentennial in 1907, which is an offshoot of his master's thesis he did at University of Richmond after having completed his BA at University of Virginia. So thanks.
Well, when Christina and Leo found me this summer and asked me to do something, and they sort of made the mistake of saying, you can pick whatever topic you want to pick. So after pondering this, I said, well, I'm going to pick something that I don't think gets spoken about often, and that's really not that much has been written about, and also something that has a very good local connection, since you're the Richmond chapter. So I stumbled back upon some research I'd done quite some time ago and said, well, that'll be fresh and new. And then in walked Carla, and in walked Amy, and I swear I forced you guys to read some of this once upon a time in a historiography seminar. Does that sound right? So let's see if you remember anything. I'll try to make it a little fresher than it was. But anyway, this topic is something that I did spend a lot of time looking at quite a long time ago, and it did ultimately become a thesis. And I had great visions of doing great things with it, but I think this is probably as great, and it is a great thing that you guys are all here to listen to me for a little bit. Christina said you wanted a lecture, which, wow, that's 7 o'clock at night. I said that's pretty bold, so I actually prepared a lecture, so we'll see. If you start to fall asleep, I'll sort of change and we'll just do something different. But anyway, let's begin, and hopefully in about 40 or so minutes we'll be done and have time for questions and other good things. Throughout this, I'm going to use the term Negro, and I hope you understand that that's a terminology that is appropriate when you study this particular topic. It was known as the Negro Exhibit, and while that may not be the accepted terminology in today's world, it is the thing that's all over the historical record, so we'll stick with that. Many of you may be aware that there was an explosion of World's Fairs in the late 19th and 20th centuries. The first one of any note was in London in 1851. It was the Crystal Palace Exposition. But from about 1876 to 1920, there were no fewer than 15 World's Fairs directed at national and international audiences that were hosted right here in the United States of America. Some of the more famous ones would be 1876 in Philadelphia, 1893 in Chicago, 1904 in St. Louis, and 1915 in San Francisco. Those are the biggies. Throughout those fairs, the United States government, private displayers, states, businesses traveled all over the world to also present at international fairs in places like Paris and Calcutta and Melbourne. And there was also a bunch of smaller little fairs sprinkled throughout the United States that were more regional in nature, many of them in the South, lots of them with sort of local messages. So this fair phenomena, Victorian fairs, were a big thing in this era. Probably the most celebrated ones were always tied to huge landmarks of history. 1876, there was a very big fair in, well, this is 1893, but 1876, the big fair in Philadelphia commemorated the Declaration of Independence. 1893, the big fair in Chicago, known as the Columbian Exposition, was to mark the 400th anniversary of Columbus landing. So all these things were tied to big historical events. I think there's St. Louis, okay? St. Louis celebrated the Louisiana Purchase in 1904, and Jamestown, of course, was deemed to celebrate the landing of the first white settlers for a permanent settlement here in the New World. Now, while true in every setting, these American fairs in particular, even more so than the world fairs, were sending a message of national pride. And they celebrated national history, they celebrated industrial growth, intellectual and technological advances, military conquest are all part of the message that is being sent here. And the most interesting thing is it wasn't just about presenting your message, it was presenting your message in comparison to others. Americans in particular love to show their technological prowess. The giant Corliss engine was displayed in Philadelphia in 1876. It generated enough energy from this engine to run all the power that was needed in this particular exhibit hall, which was known as Machinery Hall. Chicago's very famous White City, spectacular. Okay, this was built in the city of Chicago for this fair, and it had canals and famous pools, and at night it was lit up by thousands upon thousands of lights. I mean, this was built for a temporary fair, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. Technological innovations in Chicago included a 260-foot tall Ferris wheel. That's a big Ferris wheel. And that was an example of technology that people were proud of. There were inventions like the Westinghouse air brake, telephones, refrigeration methods, baby incubators popped up in a lot of these fairs. And they all presented a message that life was good, and particularly American innovation was the reason why. The ascendancy of city life was another big theme. That was a big message of these fairs, and that the urban lifestyle was the way to go. Fairgrounds became mini cities. In some cases, they had larger populations than real cities. The peak visitation day at the Chicago Fair in 1893 had over 700,000 visitors on the grounds of the fair. Okay, that's huge, all right? This left a big focus, lots of reminders for us to ponder. Chicago still has a very famous museum called the Field Museum in Chicago, which was built for the fair. In various cities, parks were built for fairs. If you've been to St. Louis, its very famous Forest Park, which sits in the middle of the city, was built for the World's Fair. San Diego has Balboa Park, which was built for the World's Fair. So there's all these lasting, that one's out of order, lasting memories. Here's the main exhibit hall in St. Louis. It no longer exists, although a replica has been recreated in Forest Park. The Pan Am exhibit in Buffalo created this spectacular building. So this wonderful thing's being built, but behind all these was oftentimes a theme of race. It was a vital theme of Victorian fairs. The portrayal of race and ethnicity was part science and part sideshow. The Smithsonian played a big role as Bureau of Ethnology, collected over 500 artifacts as part of a month-long acquisition effort in the Philippines for the 1901 fair. They brought over 100 natives from the Philippines. They put them in an 11-acre compound along an amusement promenade. Now, placing foreign people and cultures in sideshow venues sort of became a main idea behind many of these fairs. In the case of the Filipinos, they were presented as a dull-witted, lazy, childlike people in need of American help. And this was all well-timed in 1901 because what's happening? U.S. history. Philippine insurrection. Right? There you go. So presenting these kind of messages was essential to the particular time period. Okay? In other cases, San Francisco, for example, in 1915 presented an exhibit known as the Streets of Cairo, and it had belly dancers and crafty, bizarre traders. There was an exhibit called Underground China, which emphasized the seedy side of Chinese immigrant life, complete with a mock-up of an opium den. There were some more serious treatments. St. Louis hosted a gentleman named W.J. McGee of the Smithsonian Institute who used lab space at Washington University to conduct a series of measurements of strength, endurance, vision, hearing, intelligence, decision-making, and he opened his experiments to fair visitors, and over 25,000 fairgoers participated in his experiments in the first month of the fair alone. So all these presentations were developed to emphasize race, and you can probably guess, at the end of the day, they were all trying to show the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. Now, the Jamestown Tercentennial first sort of originated, and here's your first local connection, in a discussion held blocks from here over at the Virginia Historical Society on June 12th of 1900, when a resolution was passed calling for such a commemoration. In 1902, something was created called the Jamestown Tercentennial Exposition Company, and it was approved by the governor of that time. The Virginia General Assembly appropriated $200,000 in seed money for the beginning of this effort. From the very beginning, however, it was plagued by financial problems. The state charter required the raising of $1 million in capital stock for the project. It was a goal that they met, but not without a great deal of difficulty and very, very late in the game. Federal aid was blocked for this throughout much of its duration by some pretty conservative voices at the time, and without a man named Theodore Roosevelt, it probably would have never happened. Roosevelt put a lot of effort behind this thing, and he endorsed it, and with that endorsement, Congress granted about $1.3 million in June of 2006. The catch to this was that it was to be used exclusively for the federal exhibit. Everyone else was on their own. There was no money for state exhibits unless states paid for it. Corporate displays were on their nickel, and of course there was going to be no money for a Negro exhibit whatsoever. So timing's pretty key here. The final dispersal of monies from the federal government was not scheduled to be delivered till May 1st of 2007. The fair was supposed to open April 26th of 2007, so much of the money wasn't even going to happen until after the fair was supposed to begin. When this fair opened, it opened to muddy grounds. There was not a complete fairground. Many of the buildings were only half completed. Crowds waded through mud, and early fair results and early reports from the fair were pretty negative, and the belief is that this hurt this fair throughout its run, and probably is a reason that not too many people know about the Tercentennial in Virginia, whereas in Chicago and other places they know a great deal about that. That said, despite this sort of financial problem, I'm sorry, I forgot that slide. There's one of your Oriental villages, stereotypical, at the St. Louis Fair in 1904. Despite these financial problems, one of the things this fair had going for it was its natural setting. It was spectacular in location, albeit rather difficult to get to. This is called Sewell's Point, which is at Hampton Roads. You've all been by it, you just don't know it's called Sewell's Point. When you're going across the Hampton Road Bridge Tunnel, or Tunnel Bridge, and you look off to the right, you see the Norfolk Naval Base. Well, that Norfolk Naval Base sits in the grounds of where the Jamestown Tercentennial was held. So it was a spectacular place. The problem was that it was very inaccessible to most visitors to the particular fair. Now, like its predecessors, Jamestown was designed to put progress, particularly white American progress, on display. So companies like the Pullman Palace Car Company, John Deere plows, Burpee seeds, International Harvester, Studebaker cars, all reserved big distribute space there, and came up with some pretty amazing buildings, like the auditorium here, which was one of the main venues. Marine Exhibits building. These buildings were all built for this fair. They do not exist today, except in a very few cases. The Palace of Manufactures and Liberal Arts. Pennsylvania Railroad at this fair exhibited a section of the steel tubing that they would later place under the East River to make the East River Tunnel in New York. There were aeronautical displays in these buildings that featured dirigibles, balloons, all sorts of flying machines. There was a midway entertainment promenade here. In Jamestown, it was called the War Path, to bring back images of Native Americans. They had a typical street scene in Tokyo. They had quaint river craft carved through little channels built around the area that were supposed to replicate the Nile River. There was a fort built here called Old Fort Boonesborough, which had daily shows of attacks by Native Americans, and it always ended with 3 white girls being saved after first being spirited away by Native American people. There was the obligatory Filipino compound at Jamestown. If there was a secondary theme at this, besides race, it was history. Jamestown being a very historical event, states came to this to display their history. They oftentimes displayed them in buildings that they produced. The building on the left is the Pennsylvania Exhibit Space. It's a 1/3 scale model of Independence Hall, which they built on the fairgrounds. The building on the right is the Boston State House. It's a replica built for the Jamestown Fair. So the amount of effort that these people went into this was pretty amazing. The Smithsonian was a heavy player here, and the theme of history was big for them. They produced models of the Susan Constant, the Mayflower, the Claremonts. Federal government display included a copy of the Monroe Doctrine, swords of George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Zachary Taylor. The Warpath, the entertainment venue, had a reproduction and daily reenactments of the House of Burgesses. It had a reenactment of Paul Revere's Ride. It had reenactments of the battles of Gettysburg and Manassas. And out in the harbor, they actually staged a reenactment of the Monitor and the Merrimack, which is pretty amazing. Ideal setting for these things. Most famously, and by the way, a few of these buildings do exist. This is the Pennsylvania Exhibit Hall today on the grounds of the Norfolk Naval Base. I caught this out of a window. It's been modified. This front piece has been added. Some of the chimney things have blown off for the years, but a few of these buildings still do exist on the Norfolk Naval Base, and they're either offices or they are homes of high-ranking officers, which still exist there. Probably the most famous thing that happened is something known as the Great White Fleet, which many of you may recall. The Great White Fleet, Roosevelt's creation, came here in 1907, and this was the point of which they launched their year-long travel around the globe. There were navies from Great Britain, Germany, France, Austria-Hungary, even smaller countries like Argentina and Colombia sent naval fleets. It is still believed to be one of the largest, if not the largest, group assortments of navies in the history of the world off the coast of Hampton Roads. This is the main court of where things were envisioned to happen with the inner harbor there. Now, in earlier fairs, before Jamestown, Black Americans had sort of been relegated to old darky plantation venues. And themes then to depict the carefree life of slavery, which you've all heard so much about, right? Carefree life of slavery. In a lot of cases, these fairs had taken African Americans and clumped them in with West Africans and sort of botched the whole thing pretty darn badly. In general, African Americans were showed in very negative light. They were very disappointed about the way they were presented at these fairs. Their participation was scripted by other people, not by themselves, and it came nowhere close to the message that they wanted to project. Most Victorian fairs were segregated anyway. Black visitors could only come on certain days. They were relegated to bad times of the week and second-class accommodations when they came to the fair. Prophetic for the Jamestown Tercentennial was the same week that this fair opened. Also opening in the city of Norfolk was a play known as The Klansman. The Klansman was a hit play of 1907-1908. It opened to record crowds in Norfolk, so the whole symbolism of the Negro Exhibit takes on an additional meaning when you consider that. This exhibit was a culmination of over 5 years of planning, a lot of stumbles and a lot of controversy. The purpose simply was to display 300 years of advancement for African Americans in America. More important than the objects they were going to present was the obstacles that they would have to overcome to pull this together. There was all sorts of controversies, as I will show you, and they demonstrated the complexities of black life at this time period. We oftentimes have a very simplistic view of African Americans at this time, and they held a tremendous range of perceptions of themselves and how they should be presented, and this fair captured all of that. From your U.S. history background, hopefully you all recall that there was a huge debate occurring at this time amongst black leadership. There were two visions. There was the Booker T. Washington vision, and there was the W.E.B. Du Bois vision. One was a slave turned educator, author, orator, who espoused the belief, as you may recall, in self-help and industrial education and personal discipline and cooperation with whites. That was Booker T. Washington, the Bookerite view. Du Bois, on the other hand, was a Harvard-educated leader who believed in academic training for African Americans, professional skills, agitation for political and social equality. This debate played out in the exhibit at Jamestown. 1 year after the creation of the Jamestown Exposition Company, a black Richmond attorney, I'm out of sequence with my things, Mr. Waller. That's a visual of the building that you'll see a little bit later. 1 year after the Exposition Company was founded, a Richmond black attorney named Giles Beecher Jackson secured a charter from the state of Virginia to create something called the Negro Development and Exposition Company. And the purpose of this company was to show the achievements of the black race at this tercentennial. Black leaders in general embraced the idea that a fair had the potential to put them on a national and international stage. Jackson in particular, and this is him to the left, in one of the few photos that still remains of him, imagined Jamestown as a Negro exhibit unlike any other. It was to be planned by blacks, it was to be managed by blacks, it was to be supported by blacks. This was his vision. This was as much important as anything that could ever be shown. Can we pull this thing off? The exhibit and all its pieces had to be black managed in Jackson's view. Now, significant to understanding what they're going to attempt to pull off is to understand the times that they're doing this. From 1890 to 1907, there were 1,278 lynchings of African Americans in the South, 40 of them in Virginia alone. 1901 to 1902, Virginia held a constitutional convention that pretty much disenfranchised African Americans by a combination of literacy tests, poll taxes, and other impediments. Jim Crow was supreme in Virginia at this time period. There was laws passed in Virginia in 1900 segregating African Americans on rail cars, and in 1904 segregating them on the streetcars of Richmond, Virginia, which ran right out here. Times were as bad for blacks at this moment in history than at any time anyone can possibly describe. Maybe even worse than some views in slavery. Okay? Being able to pull off this exhibit in the context of this era is perhaps one of its greatest feats. Jackson was born a slave in Goochland County in 1853. And by a series of pretty unusual events, he managed to begin to be a helper in a law office of a man named William Beveridge. Now, he got a lot of personal tutoring from this gentleman, and he became an attorney and practiced law in Jackson Ward, right behind us here, until 1924. He would prove to be one of the most significant leaders in this era of Richmond black history, and a model in many ways for Booker T. Washington's theories. Both Jackson and Washington shared a similar background as slaves. Both held a firm belief in industrial education and economic advance for blacks. Jackson's Negro Exhibit would try very, very much to mirror this philosophy. And he's a controversial guy, as you will see. He's central to this exhibit, but he stumbles mightily. His first efforts were focused around his company, the Negro Development and Exposition Company of the United States of America. It's state chartered. It was authorized to issue $800,000 in capital stock, and it sat at 528 West Broad Street, the current location of the Richmond Convention Center Marriott. That's where this building sat when it was attempting this effort. Now, Jackson was a smart man, and he went around Richmond and he found very important black people. One was a gentleman by the name of W. Isaac Johnson, who's a very prominent black leader in Richmond, Virginia. Right down here on Jackson Ward, there's a pillar that has his name along the sidewalk. He operated a funeral home at the corner of Fouché and Broad Street. He was named president of this. There's a reverend from over in Manchester named Anthony Binga, B-I-N-G-A, who was vice president. A gentleman named R.T. Hill, who was a treasurer of the True Reformers Bank here in Richmond, the largest black-owned bank in America at this particular time, was the treasurer of the operation. And Jackson himself was titled the director. The stature of these people was very important. Jackson believed that if you're going to pull off this exhibit, you have to associate with top people. And so that image was one that he tried to project. He fully understood that fundraising was going to be the biggest challenges. Certainly he was willing to take government money. Certainly he was willing to take white money. But if he could not pull off this exhibit without huge amount of financial support from the black community, his feeling was that this would look like a very hollow achievement. So after its inception in 1903, he deployed a whole cadre of field agents and sent them all over the country to raise money and to also begin to collect exhibits, displays, if you will, for this big Negro exhibit at Jamestown. He was often very gutsy, unabashed about the efforts that he made in this. He directed tons of letters to Booker T. Washington himself, asking for his personal money. You visit Washington and go to the Library of Congress where the Booker T. Washington papers sit. There's just dozens of letters on almost a weekly basis from Giles Jackson of Richmond asking Booker T. Washington to make a sizable contribution. Well, to some degree this was beneficial. In October 1905, the National Negro Baptist Convention endorsed this exhibit. State Baptist conventions in North Carolina, South Carolina, and a number of other states endorsed this exhibit. The AME Conference of Virginia, Florida, and Mississippi, the Negro Business Leagues pledged support. Jackson began to get momentum. The greatest coup of all, however, was Theodore Roosevelt once again, who endorsed this particular exhibit in a visit to Richmond in 1905. Roosevelt was in town. He was traveling down Broad Street. He stopped his carriage in front of this building, and according to accounts, he summoned Mr. Jackson to the streets. And in front of all the assembled people, he will remark, and I quote, "Mr. Jackson, I congratulate you and your people on the magnificent showing you have made in your development. I am with you. I assure you and your people that you have my hearty support in the efforts you are making to have a credible exhibit of the achievements of your race, and I commend you in the effort you are making." That's the president, stopping right there on Broad Street. Now, interestingly, not all African Americans thought this was a great thing. And one is this man named John Mitchell, who is the editor of a very important paper here in Richmond known as the Richmond Planet. Mitchell despised Booker T. Washington. He despised this whole accommodationist stance towards white people. He was an advocate of Du Bois' theory of black advancement, and he very early on accused Jackson of, quote, groveling for recognition and kowtowing to white people. He asserted that the federal support, which was starting to come in at this particular time, had only occurred because of the disastrous efforts at black fundraising. And to some degree, he was kind of right, okay? Fundraising was challenging. Mitchell represents a very important idea, and that is the tremendous range of feelings within the black community about their identity and how this exhibit might display it. These two men are going to be pitted philosophically in how blacks show themselves. Now, over the entirety of the 4 years since the founding of the NDEC and the opening of Jamestown, capital stock, which was supposed to be raised in lots and lots and lots of quantity, only brought on about $50,000. The worst nightmare that Jackson could ever have envisioned was the idea that this exhibit would not get support from the open. And that appeared to be the case right close to the beginning of this whole thing. In early 1904, he had begun to drum up support in Congress. In fact, in 1905, there's record of Jackson appearing before a committee of Congress requesting $200,000 from leftover Freedmen's Bureau funds. Estimates are that there were somewhere in the neck of 480,000 Freedmen's Bureau funds sitting in the government coffers that were intended to, of course, support former black soldiers. Jackson spotted these funds. He went after them. He argued that he should be given them. He said, and I quote, "This gives us the opportunity for the greatest show to the world of our capabilities as a race as a result of what we have done in the improvement of our condition." These are his words before a committee of Congress, but he had lots of people against him, including many people within the black community. A Reverend James L. White spoke to the same committee, countering Jackson's appeal, saying that these Freedmen's Bureau funds should be used for a national memorial to honor black soldiers and to establish a home for aged black veterans. So once again, this division in the black community over this exhibit is profound. Jackson was a pretty persistent fellow, and he kept going back to Congress, and he had this very folksy, self-deprecating style, and in some of his queries before the committee, he will say pretty interesting things. One that came out, I will quote, "I noticed a provision was made for the Hawaiians and the Filipinos. What have these people ever hit a lick for to help the advancement of this country?" This is Jackson, the former slave's terminology. In another interaction, he will say, and I quote, "We will show you what marvelous progress we have made. Mind you, the Negro could not have made this progress without the assistance of white people. Down there," meaning the South, "the white people are good to colored people, except at voting time." So Jackson is a very fascinating figure in his lobbying efforts for Congress, and ultimately he was able to not shake loose the $200,000 that he asked for, but to get $100,000 out of Congress for this exhibit. Now, there were two strings attached to this $100,000. One, the production of a nice building had to be done. That was a contingency. And the second idea was that there be an oversight committee established to watch the progress. Now, this all came with 10 months before the opening date. It also coincided with a heightened criticism from certain members in the black community. While Mitchell may have started the criticism, it's quickly going to be picked up by other followers of W.E.B. Du Bois, and one of the most interesting is another newspaper man, an editor from Boston, a gentleman known as William Monroe Trotter. Trotter is the editor of something known as The Guardian. And he had earlier gone on record criticizing the Hampton Tuskegee machine, he called it, which is Washington's following. He had called Washington the great traitor, the Benedict Arnold of his race, the exploiter of all exploiters. And even though Booker T. Washington was playing no formal role in all this, clearly he was also attacking Giles Jackson and his efforts to create this particular exhibit. The New York Age is another very prominent black paper of this time period, and it was considered very moderate in terms of this debate between Bookerites and Niagarites, and yet reading about what was being planned here, they condemned the entire Jamestown venture, saying, and I quote, "We have no interest whatever in the Jamestown Exposition, and it is the matter of the utmost indifference to us whether it succeeds or fails. The civilization built upon Jamestown has been and is a curse to the Republic rather than a blessing. We refuse to be enthused over the exposition intended to celebrate the settlement of it." Wow. This very negative feeling towards Jackson, this exhibit, Jamestown, was a huge, enduring problem for the organizers. In addition, there was also a growing sense amongst Northern blacks that the idea of a separate exhibit hall was nothing more than Jim Crow. That this was a way to separate blacks out, away from the rest of the whites, and make them live in a different world, which is a long-standing insult to this community. Well, Jackson didn't sit idle. In 1906, he published a pamphlet known as Read and Think, in which he reprinted letters from prominent African Americans in support of his exhibit. The other problem, however, is that by 1906, a lot of questions began to arise about Jackson's management skills. Whether he was overwhelmed with the complexity of preparing this exhibit, or whether he was perhaps seeking some personal profit from the entire endeavor, became a big question by 1906, and it's probable that both are true. What is certain is that his management struggles are about ready to signify a huge change in the leadership of this whole exhibit. And it all was triggered in December of 1906 when the Jamestown Commission created an oversight body, which you may recall was called for in the congressional distribution of funds, and called Jackson and all the other leaders of the NDEC to Washington, D.C. to sit before Congress and explain how their progress was going. Well, under the scrutiny, Jackson fumbled badly. He showed little preparation for the hearing. He couldn't answer questions about the exhibits and its procurement of displays, storage, fundraising. He showed a lot of naivete and outright dishonesty about certain financial matters. In one example, he was called out for a request in the amount of $4,350 for exhibit advertising, which he ran in his own paper. Evidence suggested that he also had altered the dates and descriptions of work that was performed before the federal grant of $100,000 so that he could use that money to pay off his expenses prior to receiving that money. There were examples of sloppiness in bookkeeping, deception of all varieties, and though the federal government was very sympathetic to his efforts, they had also invested by this time period considerable amount of money in this project, and they did not want to see it fail. They were understanding that a man of Jackson's background, a former slave, limited education, might possess limited business savvy, but they did not want to lose their money. So accordingly, in 1907, the commission took the Negro exhibit and they placed it under executive committee leadership by a man named Thomas Calloway. Now, Thomas Calloway at this particular moment in time is a federal black employee, and he most recently has been serving in the War Department. Under some interpretations, this shift was crushing Jackson's dream of an entirely black-run exhibit. While Calloway is obviously black, and the entire executive committee was still black, the commission, which was overseeing it now, was white. And that was a problem for certain people like Jackson. Nevertheless, looking at the long view, this change in leadership probably did more to save this exhibit than anything that could have been done. And in reality, the actual day-to-day leadership remained almost exclusively in black hands. If Jackson was the dreamer, Calloway was the polished performer. He'd graduated from Fisk University in 1889. He'd served as a principal for an Indiana high school. He joined the War Department and served as a clerk during an early stage of his life. He served as president of Alcorn A&M in 1895. He had been an agent for Tuskegee University. He was managing editor of Washington, D.C.'s Colored American paper in 1898. He worked on Negro exhibits in Paris and Charleston. And along the way, he earned a law degree in 1904 from Howard University. So he's an accomplished dude. Calloway was successful. He was respected and he was ready. He was a sharp contrast to Giles Jackson. He resembled Du Bois' talented 10th. Even though he'd been a lifelong supporter of Washington, he was a new generation of black leaders. With his place secured, Calloway sprung into action very quickly. He recalled non-performing field agents. He announced a list of new categories for exhibits, giving it much greater focus, much greater concentration. He required daily progress reports from all of his field agents and employees. He established a uniform pay scale for all the NDEC employees. He created some real financial straightforwardness about an exhibit that had been run rather sloppily up until this time. And in truth, while some feared that black leadership was being eroded by this change, the truth of the matter is Calloway added some transparency to this process that secured black leadership more than it eroded it. In keeping with the commitment that this building be 100% African American, he hired a young architect, 32 years of age, named William Sidney Pittman to design the building. He hired a Lynchburg construction firm called Bowling and Everett, also 100% black, to build the 60,000 square foot structure that was 213 feet long, 129 feet wide, and 2 stories tall. A man named Arthur and Johnson, a black electrician from Wytheville, Virginia, was hired to wire the entire facility with 4,000 incandescent lamps. An estimated 100 mechanical craftsmen and laborers shuttled each day 9 miles from downtown Norfolk out to this isolated site to build this exhibit hall in a matter of several months. Calloway's influence was magical. Momentum began. People started to jump on the bandwagon suddenly. Despite some ongoing criticisms, most African Americans following this leadership shift stepped forward to assist, follow through with the duty to the race. And although the model that's now being followed feels a lot more like W.E.B. Du Bois' vision of black leadership, Calloway tapped into the power of Washington's Tuskegee machine time and time again. Tuskegee, Hampton universities both provided support from their alumni, support from their faculty, connections to numerous black newspapers, which then went on to publish solicitations and exhibit information. All these things begin to shake loose some money from the black community. Hampton Institute, which was Booker T. Washington's alma mater, would play the biggest role of any black institution, and it's logical because they fact, Hampton would even create a shuttle service from the fairgrounds that allowed people to hop on a boat and go and visit the Hampton campus during the course of the upcoming fair. As the opening date of April 26th approached, there was still a lot of concern amongst blacks about lodging, transportation, how are we going to be treated. Particularly this came from northern blacks who were not accustomed to the Jim Crow lifestyle of southern blacks. In an effort to quell this concern, the NDEC published a pamphlet in late March called An Address to the American Negro. It gave information, it gave hotel data where you can go, and promised adequate board and lodging in hotels or with families located in Norfolk, Hampton, Phoebus, Newport News, and the surrounding towns. Very, very worried about behavior of African Americans at the fair. The Address to the American Negro also warned them to be on their best behavior because they would be watched, and noted that, quote, the rowdy and shiftless element will find the white and black men united to suppress them. Pretty powerful words. Like most of the venues at the Jamestown Tercentennial, the Negro building didn't open on April 26, which was the official opening day. It was still not quite fully complete. But Roosevelt did stop by this building on opening day, even though it was not quite done. And he made a speech there. And he greeted a crowd estimated about 45,000 people who had come to the fairgrounds and basically followed him around as he toured various buildings. He said to African Americans in front of this building, quote, it is a great pleasure to be here, to go through the magnificent building and to see the unmistakable evidence of the progress you are making. I congratulate you upon it. Now, the more formal opening of this building did not occur until July 4th, during a celebration during the fair known as Jubilee Week. In celebration of this, Roosevelt did not return, but the Secretary of the Treasury came, a man named George Cortelyou. Cortelyou had also served as the last chairman of the Jamestown Commission, and he addressed black audiences at this particular building, and when doing so, took a stab at its critics, who had principally been those northern supporters of W.E.B. Du Bois, and he emphasized, quote, the progress that comes through self-help is evident here, and through the real leaders of your race, those who have your best interest at heart. The final tally for installed exhibits at this building was over 9,000. They were submitted by over 1,100 exhibitors. The largest category was what we call arts and crafts pieces. Came from all over the country. They range from china painting to sculpture to photography to portraiture to landscapes. There were 715 displays of needlework, the largest category of all. There was a historical tableau of black sculptures prepared by a very famous artist, black artist at this time named Meadow Warrick. Miss Warrick put together a series of images in sculpture of the advancement of the black race in 1619. They included the beginnings of Negro education, the savings bank, response to the call to arms, which is depicting actually black service in the Philippine insurrection, where African Americans actually made up a huge percentage of American fighting forces. The final in this series made by Warwick was actually a black college graduation ceremony with Frederick Douglass standing in the background watching all the new graduates. Agricultural exhibits were very prominent. There was the obligatory samples of wheat and corn and tobacco and vegetables. There was a 1,200 square foot collection of technical materials, the inventions and manufacturers, mechanical devices, all created by African Americans. They ran the gamut from an improved boat propeller to a better cotton chopper to a chestnut gatherer to a combination bread riser and incubator. There were model steam engines. There was this huge array of different black inventions. There was a display of 341 patents granted to African Americans, a collection of 175 black-owned and operated newspapers, an exhibit of 300 printed volumes of black authors and poets, and an alcove featuring compositions by 78 different black composers. The building included a fully operational branch of the Richmond True Reformers Bank, an institution right here in Jackson Ward, as a matter of fact, that had at the time period this fair over $330,000 in deposits, did over $1.5 million of business a year, and during the fair alone did $75,000 of business in their branch in the exhibit hall, which is pretty good, okay? There was a group of prominent black physicians who produced a display of an emergency hospital. It included 3 exhibit rooms, and it ended up having a very practical purpose in seeing a number of cases of illness during the fair. Black colleges and high schools held a central place in the whole affair. There were dozens of schools, Memphis, Tennessee, to Topeka, Kansas, that exhibited work from their students. Howard University, Fisk University tended to outshine all the others, 2 of the more prominent black schools of this time. But there were exhibits from Alcorn A&M and Claflin University in South Carolina and Wilberforce University in Ohio and Virginia Union in Richmond and an institution known as Hartshorn Academy. And where is that located? 1000 North Lombardi in this building. There's a marker out there. They exhibited at this fair. Virginia Union earned a gold medal for a very interesting exhibit that showed a blend. It was a cabinetry exhibit that showed high quality industrial craftsmanship, but it encased a pictorial history of the college and samples of students' work in Hebrew, Greek theology, psychology, and physiology, sort of that blend of the industrial and academic arguments that permeate black community of this time period. One of the highlights was the appearance of the Fisk Jubilee Singers. These were a very famous singing group out of Fisk University in this time period, and they performed numerous times at the Negro Exhibit Hall. They were one of the biggest hits. Booker T. Washington finally made his appearance on August 3rd, 1907, on what was called Negro Day, a special day for African Americans. It's estimated about 15,000 blacks showed up at the grounds, and I think they were probably the only people that were there. The day included performances by Hampton Institute Brass Band, the Fisk Jubilee Singers, a 200-person all-male chorus from Hampton University performed. Washington's speech was not the landmark event of 1895 that some of you may recall, called the Atlanta Exposition Address. But he did say some very interesting things about the meaning of the Negro Exhibit and Jamestown. He said, "It is especially fitting that since here we entered slavery, that on the same spot we should show the results of improvement in both slavery and in freedom." He prodded white Southerners to pay more attention to blacks. He condemned the continuing rash of barbarous lynchings in this time. He maintained in this speech that blacks had no intention to commingle with whites socially or politically, but he did remind whites in a speech on this day that their political futures depended upon African American voters, which was interesting for him to say. And he finally spiked the Northern critics by saying, "I believe that our people should take every opportunity, no matter whenever presented, North or South, to show the world the progress that we as a race are making. No battle has ever been won by an army standing still or sulking in its tents. Racial battles are to be won by marching forward, not by halting. All told, exhibitors at the Negro Exhibit Hall earned 25 gold, 51 silver, and 86 bronze medals, making it one of the most decorated venues at the entire World's Fair. The New York Independent, which is a white journal of this time period, will say it is safe to say that no single effort to demonstrate the Negro's claim upon the South and country for an American's fair chance has ever been as successful as the exhibit at Jamestown. By the time the fair closed, over 750,000 people had gone through the Negro Exhibit. So stepping back from this event, it seems to project numerous messages. First of all, simply, it's a great story of success by an entire race of people who were for a moment of time put on a world stage in Virginia. Wow. And considering that this is happening in one of the worst eras of race relations in all of American history, that's a pretty phenomenal achievement. Secondly, that leadership transition from Giles Jackson, a man born slave, to Thomas Callaway, with a high level of education for his day, mirrors the strengths and the great diversity within the African American community of this time. Callaway had education and expertise that the elder Jackson could not dream of. Callaway represented a new era of possibilities that had been denied blacks. The feisty, passionate, sometimes clumsy Jackson was filled with the realities of black life of his time period. Callaway was the future, Jackson was the past, but it was a past that could not be forgotten. In many ways, the two men were really the message of the Negro Exhibit at Jamestown. There you go. How's my time?
I think we have enough time for another lecture. Do you have anything?
Leah!
Did any of the critics ever come around?
Yeah, they did. A lot of them softened quite a bit, particularly after the leadership change. There was a lot more in the black press by the end that was praising this exhibit. There certainly were some entrenched critics that never came around, but it was the success, as it usually does, muted a lot of the people who had stood against it, but didn't end everyone.
Is there any feedback from white patrons of the fair?
Very pleased. They were very pleased with what had happened. There were a few incidents. I didn't go into this. I figured it was pretty long. There were a few racial incidents at this fair, but they were not associated with the exhibit or with the efforts of the NDEC. They were just the rabble-rousers that would pop up in any place at any time. So that got a lot of publicity during the fair itself. But these were the kind of things like scuffles on streetcars or people who got drunk during the fair and got in fights and that kind of thing. So the patrons stayed happy because it was a success, at least in terms of recognition and awards. The Tercentennial as a whole and the Negro Exhibit as a whole were financial disasters. Okay, and in fact, in another aspect of this, again, not to go into it too much here, but after the fair was over and this venue closed down, more and more questions about Jackson's behavior surfaced, and how he might have overly profited from putting on this particular exhibit. And he tried to, and this is kind of an interesting link, take what was left from this, and this will make Doug Wilder upset, but create the first ever African American museum. That was his vision. And one of you two may remember, where was he going to put it? Where was the first ever African American? Because you guys had to write a paper of the next thing. It was going to be put here in Richmond, Virginia. Okay, he was going to take this core collection that was created for this and start an African American exhibit. But it didn't happen. There was all kinds of financial problems. But patrons were happy for its success, but they didn't get the return that they hoped for. Nobody did. All right. Thanks for coming. Good to see you guys.
We have more donuts. Plenty of donuts.